Imagine a highway that was not allowed to cross over the sea, but forced to dive beneath it, and not for the reasons you might think. It wasn't for convenience nor cost, but because the U.S. Navy couldn't risk a single bridge collapse, turning a strategic channel into a wartime trap. That's the Chesapeake Bay Bridge-Tunnel, a 17.6-mile stretch of road that couldn't just soar over the water. It had to vanish underneath it, leaving the Atlantic Fleet's doorway wide open. In 1962, a storm tried to erase this engineering marvel before it was even finished. And today, a modern tunnel boring machine called Chesapeake is still fighting the same battle in a new era. Let's find out why this road had to go underwater and how it survived the storms of the past and the engineering challenges of the present. This is Engineering the Impossible, the Chesapeake Bay Bridge-Tunnel, as we go beyond the exit. Welcome to Beyond the Exit. My name is Scott, and I'm going to be your host. This is a place where we love telling stories of the roads that move us. Today we're looking at a highway that really shouldn't exist, the Chesapeake Bay Bridge-Tunnel. It's 17 miles of steel and stone fighting the Atlantic Ocean, but the story of how it was built was even crazier than the drive itself. And if you'd like to stick around till the end, we're going into a new section we call The Ledger, where we go into a deep dive of the facts behind this marvel. At Beyond the Exit, we like to say that every road has a reason. So before we dig into the tale of how this amazing engineering feat was accomplished, let's take a look at why it was needed at all. A bay that divided Virginia. For more than 300 years, the Chesapeake Bay didn't just separate land, it separated lives. Virginia's eastern shore sat in plain sight across the water from Norfolk, but for generations it was cut off by the mouth of the bay itself. The distance wasn't great, but the crossing was unpredictable. Wind, tide, and fog, all of it decided when people moved and when they didn't. Now, before the automobile, the isolation was inconvenient. Once cars and trucks arrived, it became a problem. And by the early 20th century, ferries were the only way across. They carried people, produce, livestock, and eventually cars. But they were slow and limited and entirely at the mercy of the weather. A crossing could take more than an hour on a good day. On bad days, the boats simply didn't run. That uncertainty shaped everything. In fact, it left a growing line of trucks and freight haulers with limited space on each deck. And by the 1950s, those constraints left lines that stretched for miles waiting to cross. Traffic kept growing and delays were stacking up. And every storm reminded people that the crossing could disappear at a moment's notice. In other words, the passage was at a breaking point. In everyone's mind, there was no longer a question of whether a fixed crossing should exist. It was how to build one in a place that refused to cooperate. Because the Chesapeake Bay isn't a quiet inland river. It's an open gateway to the Atlantic and all that comes with it. And any attempt to cross it would have to answer to forces far larger than traffic alone. Why a bridge wasn't enough. At first glance, the solution seemed obvious. If Virginia wanted to cross the Chesapeake Bay, why not just simply build a bridge? By the 1950s, bridges were being built everywhere, longer, higher, and stronger than ever. On paper, a bridge looked like the fastest and most practical answer. But one very important piece of information was not considered with those initial proposals. You see, this stretch of water is not just any other crossing. The mouth of the Chesapeake Bay is the front door to Naval Station Norfolk, the largest naval base in the world. Every aircraft carrier, destroyer, and supply ship assigned to the Atlantic Fleet must pass through a narrow, deep water corridor known as the Thimble Shoal Channel in order to reach the open sea. Especially during the Cold War, that reality changed everything. Navy planners raised a concern that engineers and politicians could not dismiss. If a conventional bridge collapsed into the channel, whether from accident, storm, or an attack, the wreckage could block the passage entirely. The fleet could be trapped inside the bay or prevented from returning when it needed to most. It was rightfully termed the cork in a bottle scenario, and the Navy made its position very clear that that risk was unacceptable. The resulting message to Virginia was unmistakable. If a fixed crossing was going to exist, nothing could stand above the most critical shipping lanes. That single requirement ruled out the simplest solution and forced the engineers to stop planning how to cross the bay and start thinking about how to disappear beneath it. The only solution. Once the Navy made their positions clear, The problem changed completely. The question was no longer how to build a bridge across the Chesapeake Bay, it was how to create a crossing that would never block the water beneath it. The answer could be called a compromise. Instead of one continuous structure, engineers proposed a chain of different structures, each designed to solve a specific problem. Low-level trestles would cross the shallow sections of the bay where navigation was limited. High-level bridges would span secondary channels where collapse would not cripple maritime traffic. But under the two most critical shipping lanes, the Thimble Shoal Channel and the Chesapeake Channel, the roadway would disappear entirely. The result would be a hybrid crossing described as a string of pearls. Bridges, islands, and tunnels linked together into a single continuous highway. It was quite elegant on paper, but the reality was complex in practice. To make the tunnels possible, engineers first had to solve an even harder problem: where to put the entrance. There was no land at the edge of the shipping channel, only open water, soft seabed, and strong currents. If the road was going to dive underground, it needed solid ground to do it. That meant creating land where none existed. The solution was to build 4 artificial islands in open water, positioned precisely at the end of the tunnels. These islands would anchor the entire system, housing ventilation buildings, emergency access, and the transition from bridge to tunnel. But what sounded like a simple solution was anything but. These islands would have to survive Atlantic storms, underwater currents, and decades of erosion, all while supporting some of the most complex construction ever attempted in the bay. After all, the entire project depended on it. Building land in the ocean. 4 artificial islands were planned, 2 at the Thimble Shoal Channel and 2 at the Chesapeake Channel. Each would rise from the bay floor in water more than 30 feet deep, exposed to waves rolling in from the Atlantic. They would have to survive long before they ever carried traffic. Construction began by placing rock dikes on the seabed to define the shape of each island. Inside those boundaries, millions of cubic yards of sand were pumped into place using hydraulic dredges. What emerged was not solid ground at first, but a temporary landscape that had to settle and stabilize under its own weight. To facilitate that settlement, the islands were intentionally built higher than the final elevation, allowing the soft sediments below to compress before permanent structures were added. Only after that movement slowed could construction continue. To protect the sand cores from being washed away, the islands were armored with massive stone. Layers of rock were placed carefully, from smaller filter stone to enormous granite blocks, weighing several tons each. This armor extended well above and below the waterline, shielding the island from wave action, tides, and storm surge. For a time, it was an astonishing sight, land appearing where there had only been open water before. Tunnels built like ships. The tunnels beneath the Chesapeake Bay were not carved through solid rock. They were built somewhere else entirely. Instead of boring through the seabed, engineers chose an approach that treated each tunnel as a massive prefabricated structure. The tunnel sections were constructed far from Virginia, built as steel shells at shipyards, equipped to handle vessels hundreds of feet long. Each section actually resembled a ship more than a tunnel, sealed and designed to float. Once completed, the sections were launched into the water. The journey on the water alone was a risk. Losing a section at sea would have delayed the project by months, but while the tubes were being built and transported, another operation was underway beneath the water. A trench was stretched across the bottom of each shipping channel, wide enough to receive each tunnel. This was not a haphazard operation either. The bottom of each trench was prepared with extreme care. A layer of pea gravel was placed and leveled within inches, using a specialized screed rig dragged along the seabed. The tolerances they had to meet were very unforgiving for the location. If the foundation was uneven, though, the rigid tunnel sections could crack or fail once buried under the sand and water. When the time came, each tube was carefully positioned over the trench and slowly lowered into place. Submerging each tunnel section required a small team of divers in the water, supported by dozens more topside. Once the two pieces met, they were sealed from the outside underwater using concrete poured through a tremie pipe. After the joint cured, the water trap between the bulkheads was pumped out, and the workers entered the tunnel to weld the steel shells together from the inside. Concrete lining followed that, transforming the floating steel vessels into a permanent roadway beneath the bay. One by one, the sections were connected, backfilled, and buried. When finished, Ships could pass overhead with 50 feet of water above the tunnel roof, unaware that traffic was moving beneath them. It was heavy marine construction carried out with watchmaker precision, and it left no margin for error, a true testament to the skills of the crews who accomplished it. The assembly line at sea. While tunnel sections were being lowered beneath the shipping channel, most of the crossing was taking shape above the water. The majority of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge-Tunnel consists of low-level trestles stretching for miles across shallow water. These spans had to be built quickly, consistently, and with absolute precision. There was no bedrock to anchor them to. The seabed was made of sand, silt, and clay, and layered thousands of feet deep. This meant that every support pile relied on friction alone. Massive de-stressed concrete cylinder piles were driven deep into the seabed, some reaching more than 170 feet below the waterline. Once in place, those piles would grip the surrounding sediment tightly enough to carry the weight of the roadway, traffic, and storms for decades to come. To do that work efficiently, the project depended on a specialized piece of equipment. To do a job efficiently, you need a proper tool. Driving the concrete piles was no exception. The construction crews relied on their specialized tool, known simply as Big D, a jack-up, pile-driving platform designed to turn open ocean into stable worksite. Steel legs were lowered into the seabed, and the platform lifted itself clear of the waves. Once elevated, cranes and hammers could operate with a level of precision that a floating barge could never achieve. With this tool in their hand, construction moved like an assembly line. Piles were positioned, jetted into the sand, and driven to a final depth, one after another. And within a short time, the trestles were advancing steadily across the bay. But that efficiency came with a cost. Relying completely on Big D meant there was no backup. Replacement equipment was limited, less stable, and far less efficient. And the entire schedule was dependent on keeping that machine operating. So by the early 1960s, the project was moving forward on a very tight timeline. And that's when the ocean decided to remind everyone who was in charge. When the ocean found the weak point. By early 1962, construction was advancing on a tight, unforgiving schedule. However, all of this was about to change because a nor'easter stalled off the Atlantic coast. Unlike most hurricanes, it didn't strike or move on. It stayed. Wind and surge poured into the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. Big D was jacked up to ride the storm out, but waves began striking the bottom of the elevated deck. Each impact drove force down through the steel legs. Finally, it could take no more. The legs gave way and Big D collapsed into the sea. As the storm continued to batter the site, crews were lifted off by helicopter in dangerous conditions. Thankfully, no lives were lost in the collapse, but the damage did not end there. Across the project, partially armored sections of the artificial islands had eroded, stripping away sand from where the protective rock had not been yet placed. The storm had exposed weaknesses that could not be ignored, and yet in the aftermath, something important became very clear. The concrete piles that had already been driven held firm. The tunnel sections beneath the seabed did not shift, and the storms had tested the work under real conditions. The core design had survived. However, from that moment on, crews left nothing partially protected. It was a vital lesson learned, and each crew moved forward with their work knowing that the environment could change at a moment's notice. Opening day and the limits of success. In the storm's aftermath, the crews didn't just pick up where they left off. The overall schedule was delayed by nearly 3.5 months due to the storm. By the spring of 1964, the worst of what the Chesapeake had delivered had been absorbed, and on April 15th, the Chesapeake Bay Bridge-Tunnel opened to traffic. For the first time in Virginia's history, the eastern shore was now connected to the mainland by a fixed roadway. The ferries that had defined the life along the bay for generations were no longer the only options. Drivers could cross the water now on their own schedule. It was an experience unlike anything motorists had known before. The road stretched out across open water, dropped beneath the bay through tunnels, then rose again onto islands that were built from the sea itself. But once that novelty faded, the realities of operating the crossing became crystal clear. The original facility was only 2 lanes, one northbound, one southbound, with no physical separation between traffic. In many places, there were no shoulders and no escape route, and no way to reroute vehicles once they were committed to the crossing. Any incident, no matter how minor, had the potential to shut the entire structure down. And while the Chesapeake Bay Bridge-Tunnel was a triumph, and it did work, doing exactly what it was designed to do, but unfortunately, it was operating close to its very own limits, almost from the moment it had opened. By the late 1980s, it was clear that the Chesapeake Bay Bridge-Tunnel could not continue operating as it was. Traffic volumes had grown steadily for decades, and the two-lane configuration that had seemed somewhat antiquated by the late 1960s had now become a liability. But teams had already been working on an answer to this. Engineers were proposing building a second set of trestles alongside the original ones, effectively creating a parallel roadway. Northbound and southbound traffic would finally be separated, reducing the risks of head-on collisions and improving capacity across much of the bay. Construction began in the mid-1990s, with new trestles being built carefully beside the existing structure, only just a few feet away while traffic continued to flow. It was a delicate operation, and it was carried out in the open water. When the parallel trestles opened in 1999, the improvement was immediate, but the expansion was incomplete at the two tunnels. The crossing narrowed again. 4 lanes of traffic were forced to merge into 2, recreating the same bottlenecks that had existed before, and the tunnels then became the weakest link in this chain. To solve that problem would require another leap in engineering, one that reflected how much the world had changed since the original tunnels were built. A new tunnel for a new era. Solving the tunnel bottleneck meant returning to the most difficult part of the entire crossing. The original tunnels were built using immersed tube construction, a method suited for the technology and environmental standards of the early 1960s. But repeating that approach decades later came with new complications. For instance, dredging trenches across an active shipping channel would disrupt maritime traffic and disturb large volumes of sediment on the bay floor. Thankfully, engineering had moved on, and so had the expectation. Instead of cutting a trench, engineers chose to bore a new tunnel beneath both channels, using a tunnel boring machine. This method allowed ships to pass freely above while construction continued below, leaving the seabed largely undisturbed. The machine was massive and purpose-built, designed to operate under extreme pressure, and it functioned as a moving factory, cutting through saturated soil and installing concrete tunnel segments behind it, one ring at a time. But even the best technology can hit a snag. Partway into the drive, the machine struck something unexpected, a ship's anchor, which had been buried in the sediment, lost decades earlier, and never recorded on any chart. The impact damaged the cutting tool and halted progress. To recover, crews had to stabilize the ground ahead of the machine and enter the cutter head under hyperbaric conditions. It was slow, hazardous work and delayed the project for nearly a year. But in January of 2025, the machine finally broke through into the receiving island. The most difficult part of the phase of the new tunnel was now complete. The living structure. The Chesapeake Bay Bridge-Tunnel was never meant to be a static monument. Every major decision was shaped by what the bay would allow, and often what it would not. 17.5 miles of bridges, trestles, tunnels, and artificial islands were assembled in open water, with tolerances measured in inches and consequences measured in lives and years. Even by modern standards, work at this scale under those conditions would be considered difficult. But realizing this was accomplished in the 1950s and early 1960s is what makes it truly remarkable. The crossing stands as a measure of what mid-century engineering and construction crews could achieve in a time when the technologies we enjoy today were just a dream. The Chesapeake Bay Bridge-Tunnel solves a simple problem at extreme scale. It connects to shores in open water, both above and below it, and makes that amazing crossing seem ordinary. The ledger. Telling a good historical story requires a lot of careful research. And while I spent nearly 3 weeks preparing this video, I don't claim this to be the final word. Only an honest attempt to bring some history hiding in plain sight back to life. Research for this episode included National Archive materials, project reports, original documentation, and resources from the Chesapeake Bay Bridge-Tunnel itself. You'll find links to those sources in the description if you want to explore them further. As with many large historical projects, some information was contradictory and had to be carefully weighed, so items that were suspect were definitely omitted from the story. Now, if you have additional insight or first-hand knowledge we may have missed, I always welcome it. Reading your stories and comments is one of the most rewarding parts of running this channel. Let's get started with the facts. So, the human cost side of this. At its peak, this job site had over 2,000 workers out there in the Atlantic, and considering they were working in rough water, underwater, and on top of shifting sand, the safety record is surprisingly decent, but definitely not perfect. 7 men lost their lives building this original span, an unfortunate reality of heavy marine construction in the 1960s. Breaking down the structure itself, it's not just one continuous bridge. It's a complex of 6 separate systems. You have the 2 high-level steel bridges, the North Channel Bridge and the Fisherman's Inlet Bridge. These are the giants that lift you up over the fishing fleets, using thousands of tons of steel plates and trussworks to clear the water. Then you have the 2 tunnels, the Thimble Shoal and Chesapeake Channel. Each one is roughly a mile long. Connecting it are all the trestles. This is the low-level causeway that makes up the bulk of the drive. 12.5 miles of it. It consists of 858 individual precast concrete spans, each one 75 feet long, marching across the bay. And what holds them up? Well, we're talking about 2,600 pre-stressed concrete cylinder piles. Each one is 54 inches wide and was driven more than 170 feet deep, as we mentioned earlier. That wasn't just a random hole, that was the average resistance depth to keep it just from sinking into the mud. To put that in perspective, bedrock is between 2,000 and 6,000 feet in this area. Then, of course, we have the 4 man-made islands. We definitely said they were big, but try 4 million cubic yards of sand big. That's enough to fill the Empire State Building roughly 3 times over. To keep that sand from washing away, they used 1.2 million tons of rock armor. Some of the individual boulders on the outer ring weighing 4 tons apiece. And finally, we have the tubes that the tunnels themselves were built out of. The originals weren't bored, they were immersed. They were built from 37 individual steel tube sections per tunnel, a total of 74 between the 2. Each section is roughly 300 feet long, all built in Orange, Texas, and towed 2,000 miles up the Gulf and along the coast to get there. When they sank them, they landed on a gravel bed leveled to within 1.2 inches. That's pretty high precision considering it was done from a barge. And speaking of barges, let's not forget the Big D. When that machine sank in 1962, it was valued at $1.5 million. To rebuild it today would be anywhere between $20 and $40 million, depending on the manufacturing firm. Last but not least, one of my favorite facts about the entire project: not 1 cent of federal, state, or local tax money went into the construction of this project. That also includes the new tunnel bore. All that was raised through selling bonds and collecting the money back from those who used it in tolls. Now, we do plan on doing a future video once the second tunnel is completed and dedicated, kind of as a follow-up to what we've done here. If you've got any suggestions for that, please let us know. We'll be glad to add those where we can into the video as well. Also, if you're enjoying our Engineering the Impossible series, I'd like to suggest these 2 videos that will be showing up on the screen now. One is about the Eisenhower-Johnson tunnels, the highest tunnels ever built in the United States, and the construction of I-70 through Glenwood Canyon, Colorado. They're both videos nearly identical in style to this one. You know, I realize there are a lot of other places you could go on YouTube to look for your entertainment, and I just want to say thank you for stopping in and spending time with us. As always, we want to say thank you, best wishes to you in the new year, and God bless.